Sorry for the delay, but I do think we finally have our audio and video working. We have our broadcast working. So we're going to go ahead and get started with the meeting. I apologize for the delay, but we did want to make sure everything was working under Governor Lee's orders of our virtual public meetings. This is obviously a virtual public meeting of the Aesthetic Plan Committee that's working on looking at small cells in our area and poles in general in our area. I think most everybody knows each other. David Smoke, town administrator here at the town of Farragut. And let's go through the committee members real quick, just so everybody can see and know who each other is. Maybe John, would you like to go next? You'll have to unmute though before we do that.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I'm John Hoffman. I'm a resident of Sweetbriar and a longtime resident, 32-year resident of Farragut.
All right. How about you, Jeremy?
Jeremy Walden. I'm the Director of Engineering and Operations at Lenore City Utilities Board.
Great. Thanks, Jeremy, for being part of our committee. Mayor Williams?
Mayor Williams, present.
Okay, and I know Vice Mayor Pavlin is also here. All right, now we can hear you, Louise.
Can you hear me?
We can?
A little bit. A little bit.
You don't need to hear me. No.
Okay. Well, now we have you. All right. And then Mark, you want to introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, I'm Mark Shipley, Community Development Director, and I'll be boring you for the next hour and a half.
Thanks, Mark. I know we've got a couple press on the line as well. Gabby with the Shopper and Michelle with the Farragut Press. I don't believe there's any other press on here, but if there are, please let us know. All right, and just so everybody understands that this meeting is broadcast live, and it's also going to be on the town's YouTube channel when we get done. So that way we can go back and reference this anytime we need to. But tonight, again, I appreciate the committee's time. We're focusing on an aesthetic plan for the town. Mark has been doing a lot of work on this plan and getting things together, a lot of research on this. So what we really need from the committee tonight is as much feedback as you can give us on things we need to be careful of, watch out for, things you like, things you don't like, if we're heading in the right direction, or do we need to start all over again? So those are kind of just as much feedback as you can give us, and we'll try to get as much done as possible by 7 o'clock and be wary of your time, so that way you're not out too late tonight. But again, appreciate it, and I'll turn things over to Mark.
Okay, thanks, David. Yeah, I'll try to get through this, as we do have a lot of information to try to cover. And I will be jumping out of this screen and getting into some information that Verizon provided to the town a few weeks ago, and just kind of going through that pretty briefly. And it shows a lot of different images of small cell structures that in different materials and styles and settings and things like that, just to give you an idea of what might be possible from the provider's perspective. This is kind of our agenda for today. We've already had introductions. I'm going to give you just a brief background on what we're doing and what our role is. And we'll talk through some basic terms and considerations and some options. And then we'll take a look at some things that Verizon sent, as I mentioned earlier, and then we'll come back to this PowerPoint and go through the draft plan that the staff has put together to really solicit feedback from you all. And I really appreciate having, your all's participation, especially with your backgrounds. And I think it's going to be very, very beneficial and make the plan a much better product. So we'll get started. I'm not going to read through all this, but this is the what is considered an aesthetic plan, at least in terms of small wireless facilities. That was part of the 2018 wireless plan or law that was passed by the state of Tennessee. It's a pretty long definition and it's pretty broad, frankly. There's a lot of things that can constitute an aesthetic plan or an element of an aesthetic plan. We already do a lot of those things, and I'm going to talk through some of those. But I guess what we're trying to do at this point is maybe to formalize what we mean by an aesthetic plan as it relates to vertical utilities in our public rights of ways. So, as I mentioned, some of our specific goals that we're looking for here. I think it's important that we pay attention to the appearance of our community. I think it's why a lot of people move here and do business in Farragut. You can always tell when you enter or leave the town. And I think that's something that we take a lot of pride in. So when we have these new utility systems that are proposed and they have a vertical component, what we're trying to do is make sure that those are as attractive as possible. There are as few of them as possible, and that they're appropriate for the context of where they're being proposed. So, eliminating or minimizing visual clutter, being consistent with the new vertical utility structures. This plan is not just dealing with small cell support structures. It's any new vertical utility structures that would be in public rights of ways. So that could be really in the context of what we have in the town, since all of our utilities are required to be underground, all the new ones, what we're really talking about are telecommunications and street lighting for the most part. So that's really what this plan is focused on. And then just kind of, protecting the more sensitive parts of our town, the residential areas, the historic structures, areas that are gateways to our community so that they have an extra attractive feel to them as you come into Farragut. And then to try to, plan ahead, think ahead for future technologies. We've talked about this fiber installation issue for a couple of years. What should we be requiring somebody to put a telecommunications fiber in as part of new subdivisions to plan ahead so that you won't have to come in later and disrupt some existing residential areas in particular. But frankly, we really, this technology is so ever changing, it's really hard to know what to prescribe at this point and if that's really appropriate or necessary. So this plan is, with some of the components, is trying to address that. Some things that we do right now that would constitute an aesthetic plan. One thing that we do that apparently a lot of other communities don't do is we do actively enforce Tennessee Code Section 13.4-104. And that is basically that any new utilities have to come through the Planning Commission for review and approval. And the main reason for that is for coordination, because the Planning Commission is the body representing the town that's the most familiar with the built environment of the community. So if somebody's proposing a new utility project or some modification to an existing utility, that's why it goes through that board, because we can mention that, hey, we've got a road project planned in 3 years in this location. You might want to think about that. We may have something else in a different location. It's really just for coordination. Something else that we've required really almost since the town was founded was placing all new utilities underground. And that's, obviously had a big visual impact on our community. So all the newer subdivisions are going to have all the utilities underground. The only The only above ground structures that you're typically going to see, you might see some transformers, but you're mainly going to see residential streetlights if that subdivision chooses to have those. And not all of those are in the public rights of ways. We'll talk about that in a minute. The architectural design standards talks a little bit about utilities and the importance of hiding them or concealing them to the greatest extent possible. In 2017, in response to a couple of small cell support structures that we had come to our community in Parkside Drive, we actually went back and revisited our cell tower provisions because they were really only targeting microcells, the big tall cell towers that are on private property, to try to update both of those provisions and then also create some provisions that deal with these small cell support structures and DAS technologies. So we put a lot of things in place. We spent a lot of time. We had a couple of experts in the telecommunications field help us through that process. And I thought we had a pretty good document. There's a lot of things in that would constitute elements of an aesthetic plan. But unfortunately, some of those things were superseded or essentially nullified when the state adopted their telecommunications law in 2018, roughly a year after ours. So you could see on the screen there the different things, different components in our current antennas and towers section, which is in our zoning ordinance, that would really constitute elements of an aesthetic plan. Some additional options to consider now that we've had the state create some provisions that supersede what we have. We kind of went back to the drawing board and asked ourselves, within the state law, what can we do? And then, how do we go about doing that? So some additional options that we're looking at are just ways to enhance the aesthetic language that's in our current zoning ordinance. And perhaps, since this doesn't just deal with telecommunications, create a separate section in the municipal code for an aesthetic plan. And we would need to obviously cross-reference, the antennas and telecommunications section or other sections that might deal with street lighting and things like that. But this would essentially be a document that would very clearly and very prescriptively address the appearance of these new vertical utility systems. So that's really the void we're trying to fill, is some of the language that we have in our current telecommunications ordinance was intentionally a little vague, like stealth technology. We do define it, but it's still a little bit subjective. So one of the things that we're trying to do with this plan is to take out a lot of that subjectivity and make it very prescriptive. And we'll talk about that when I get to discussing the staff's draft. So we're really trying to capitalize on the things that the state says we can do. We can regulate to some extent what these structures look like. The only thing we can't do is regulate it to the extent that it would prohibit the function of that particular utility. So, as long as we're not, creating a regulation that effectively prohibits these providers from, rendering their services, then, we can ask them and have them make them look a certain way in different parts of the town. I'm going to jump out of this real quick, and I'm going to go into the Verizon document and just show you some of the things that they have told us and shown us that they can and are doing in different areas. And this will give you an idea of what a bunch of different poles look like. So let me do that. Okay, and I'm just going to go through this pretty quickly, but I think it's a really good document because it has a lot of visuals and it gives you some ideas. One of the first things it talks about, and this is from the state law, is the height provisions that are in the state law. Just as a refresher, this is really a small self-support document here. We're not really talking much about lighting here. So in residential areas in the state law, these poles can go up to 40 feet. In non-residential, it's 50 feet. So that was something that was altered from what the town had adopted in 2017. We had a kind of a lower height provision. The state's kind of gone in the opposite direction and looked at if you've got a utility system in the area, you basically can go higher than the highest rather than higher than the lowest utility pole in that system. So that's some of that. Just a little breakdown on what these poles look like and the kind of structures that are on them. I think you all had access to this, so I'm not really going to spend a lot of time on it. I guess one of the overall goals of the draft that I put together is to create a pole that is fairly seamless. It doesn't have a lot of stuff hanging off of it, for an easy way to describe it. So if you look at the 5G pole on the left, it's got decorative lighting, which we can talk about. The cantenna or the antenna shroud is at the top. And all the equipment is either underground or in the pole itself. And if you look at the wooden pole on the right, it's fairly stealth as far as the antenna, but they do have the 4G radio equipment that's, creating some bulk on the side of the pole, and that would be pretty noticeable. So again, we're trying to figure out ways to, make that as minimal bulk, visual bulk as possible. And it's really would be a challenge on these wooden pole systems because there's really no opportunity to put anything inside the pole, obviously. And then they go through a series of different kind of options, and I won't spend too much time on these. Pole co-location. No, Jeremy's with us here with LCUB. That obviously, from the town's perspective, is our favorite result. Is if you've got a utility system that's already in place, there's a way that you can add your structures to that existing utility system. That's the best option because you're not creating additional new vertical utilities. So these are some different images of poles. Some are really stealth. Some are, a little bit more bulky. Some 4 and 5G. The 4G, the radio antenna cabinet on the 4G is something that creates some bulk with that kind of system. And what I'm proposing in the draft is if you have a 4G system, that radio cabinet is actually at the base of the metal pole, and we'll talk about pole materials in a minute. But when I get to that, and that way it's more part of the pole as opposed to protruding out from the pole. If you've got an existing wooden pole that's part of an overhead utility system, like a distribution or, well, really just a distribution line system, and they're going to add back a wooden pole, then you really don't have a lot of options. So you just try to make the size of that cabinet as as small as possible, keep it as close to the pole as possible. They get into some decorative poles, and these are metal pole options, which, by the way, is what I'm proposing for all replacement poles or new poles in the draft. That's something that I do need feedback on. And the main reason for that is you can put a lot of stuff inside the pole, and it has more opportunities for additional uses in the future. That was one of the things I was talking about as an objective of the plan, was to try to think ahead. So it's kind of like building a stucco building versus a brick building, and different construction types. What we're trying to do is provide something that has, some substance to it, that's able to carry additional weight if that becomes an issue or a necessity with future technologies, so that we hopefully won't have to keep adding additional poles throughout the community, because nobody knows what we're going to see in 5 to 10, 20 years from now. I mean, all these poles may be gone, but there may be a lot more of them. So we're just trying to think ahead with a material that is, sustainable and can create a lot of options for the future. And so these are pretty nice looking poles, 4 and 5G combinations. These are obviously with some decorative lighting. And then some standalone metal poles with different configurations. The one in the middle is probably most similar to what's on Parkside Drive. Those are metal light poles, and they have the antenna near the top of those poles, but the antenna does kind of extend out away from the pole, which is a little bit different than what we're recommending in the aesthetic plan. Then some of these other antennas are pretty stealth. This example on the left actually is a pole in Farragut. That was one of our early poles with Zayo. It was put in 2017. And you can see some other, I'm just showing you these to show you that there's really a lot of choices out there. These companies can do more than they may, initially say they can do or would want to do, if the community has something in place that says, yeah, this is what we expect and what you need to do. And then they have some visuals here of a little bit more detail. Here's a 4-5G combination with a light extension opportunity. But again, you see that. That's one thing I need your all's feedback on. You see that 4G cabinet that extends off the pole. What I'm recommending is that be incorporated into the base of the pole. We'll see an example of what that looks like later. I think it just looks a little bit more stealth than that option there. Here's another one that not a bad looking pole, but the 4G cabinet kind of takes away a fair amount of the stealth aspect of that. Another example. I'm just going to get through these pretty quick. So I want to spend most of the time on draft and getting your all's feedback, but most of these 5G poles that they show, these metal ones, are really pretty stealth. The 4-5G combination, which is what we would be recommending on a new pole in a new location, it has to have a dual function, whether it's 4 and 5G or whether it's Verizon and AT&T or Verizon and US Cellular or telecommunications and lighting. It just has to be able to provide for at least 2 different functions on that pole. And these are generally, most of these poles that we're looking at are 10 to 12 inches in diameter. What I'm proposing in the draft is 12.75. That's a pretty common standard from what I've looked at. Here's a pretty stealth 5G pole with a 12-inch diameter, and it's got the street light incorporated up near the top. And that, I don't think most people would really ever notice that.
Mark, what's the size of the top?
Those are about 5. You're talking about the antenna, the height of the antenna?
Yeah, the size of the antenna, yeah.
The diameter is going to be between, depending on whether this one's just a 5G, so it's going to be between 16 and 20 inches in diameter. And then, anywhere from 3 to 6 feet in overall height, depending on whether it's a combination. This one is not a combination, it's just a 5G pole. Trying to get to one of these that has, now here's a 4 and 5G, and you can see how much bigger that antenna is at the top because it's got both of those antennas in that shroud at the top of the pole. And then you got the 4G radio cabinet there about halfway down. This one, this is another 5G, just the 5G. So that's something, if you didn't require more than one potential carrier, then, obviously your antenna would be smaller. But on the downside is you might have more poles. So that's something to think about.
Mark, I have a question also on that one, and maybe
Okay.
Jeremy can help us on this. There is a meter on there that protrudes. On this inch pole diameter, you see the meter down there. Can that be inset into the pole? Because now, Jeremy, I don't think they read meters anymore. Isn't that done electronically? You'll have to unmute.
I'm sorry. I was trying to use my space bar to unmute. But we read them remotely now. We do check. I don't know if there's a technology out there like that could install the base inset into the pole. As long as it met our requirements as far as just being able to accept the type of meter that it requires and everything, as far as the prongs and the connectivity in there, we wouldn't have an issue with it. The base, as long as we could remove it easily, we wouldn't have a problem with it. I just don't know if that technology's out there.
Yeah, just curious.
I do know that just from a structural loading analysis standpoint, when you start putting insets at the base of the pole because of that bending moment and things at the bottom of the pole, it does the integrity of the pole becomes it's a little less. But being that there's nothing pulling on one way or the other of this pole other than maybe wind or something, I don't know that would be an issue.
Okay, thank
And I'm just going to keep going through these if I see anything that stands out. Again, and some of like this one, Mayor, some of those structures are higher up on the pole, which they can probably put it on the pole wherever it needs to go, but that may or may not help with the stealthness of it.
I was concerned about the stealthness. I was concerned about the possibility of damage by somebody.
Yeah.
In other words, vandalism.
Oh yeah, that's always a possibility. I'm sure Jeremy's had some transformers tagged before with some
we've got
creative.
We've got quite a few poles with meters down on the base of them. It doesn't seem to be a real issue for us as far as vandalism goes.
Well, I don't think people really concern themselves with what carries the electricity as far as the type of pole. They concern themselves with some technology that they may not necessarily like in their neighborhood.
True.
Yeah, that could be. Yeah. Now this pole here is probably one of the more similar to what we're proposing in our draft aesthetic plan with the antenna. You've got the transitions, the different components on the pole. where they're tapered, and it's like a smooth, seamless kind of transition. And then that equipment cabinet's at the bottom, it's at the base. Now that obviously does create more space at the ground interface. So if you've got things that could conflict, like a sidewalk or landscaping, that physical space might be a little bit larger by having the radio cabinet down there as opposed to being up on the riser pole. So that's something to think about. I just, from my perspective, and it may just be my perspective, I think that is a better looking pole because it kind of balances itself out. It doesn't have something kind of hanging midway off of the riser pole as you go up. Just looks a little bit more stealth to me. So that's kind of a good example of what we're looking at. You can kind of get creative with these 4G cabinets, I guess, and make them into the town has their seasonal banners, and I guess you could maybe get creative and do something with one side of them. This is actually a square pole.
Of course, we wouldn't want those banners in a residential area.
Yeah, I was just throwing that out there because they have one on this one as a way to maybe make it more stealth looking or blend in. And then they had some information here and that's basically all that I had on that particular document. Did anybody have anything they want me to go back in this for before I go back to the PowerPoint? Is that really just wanted to show you all there's just so many different styles and options out there that we could look at.
Just a quick comment on slides 5 and 7 of their proposal. You'll see poles that are placed very close to driveways. And that would be something that I personally wouldn't recommend from a safety standpoint. You'd have a see over issue or see around issue, but equally important, you've got people trying to drive in and out of their driveways and flipping the poles with trailers or moving trucks or whatever.
Yeah.
That would be a concern that I would have. I'm not sure it's aesthetic as much as it is safety, but
yeah, and we do, on those, what those will be called in our draft are type 3 poles, because there'll be new poles and new locations. And we do have some placement considerations that are built into the draft that talk about, where you're placing these new poles and making sure you're not creating conflicts or visibility obstructions and things like that. And we'll go over that here in a minute. But were you talking about these here, John?
Yeah, if you look at where that pole is, I mean, that's probably 1.5 feet from that fellow's driveway. I'd hate to get him moving there, or a house trailer or a boat or whatever.
Yeah, we actually had one of the nodes that the Planning Commission looked at back in January. They had to move it a few feet away from the guy's driveway because he came to the Planning Commission meeting and had a concern about that. He said he wasn't a good driver and he's very likely going to hit that thing one day.
Yeah.
So I guess they realized that they didn't want to have that chance being taken, and so they ended up moving that a few feet away from the driveway. So hopefully, if we run into situations like that, they can, they can move them at least 10 to 15 feet one way or the other, hopefully. Because that's going to be important with a lot of areas where you got potential conflicts.
Sure.
All right, so I'm going to jump out of this unless anybody else has anything on this one. And we'll go back into the other PowerPoint. We'll jump back into where we were at. And now I really want to spend most of the rest of what we have here talking through the draft aesthetic plan and just going through what the current components are, and then asking you all some questions about the plan and get your feedback. It is a draft. There's still, and I understand in putting this together, there's still a lot of stuff that I'm not happy with, and it needs to be I just was at a point where I really needed some feedback to know which direction to go. So let me just go through this draft by section and just talk through a little bit what we're talking about here. Obviously, with any document, you always want to have an authority section. We did that with the sign ordinance, John, as you remember. And then kind of related to that, a need. Why do we have this document? What are we trying to accomplish by having this document? In the need section, we talk about the town's high aesthetic standards that we've always expected, and the fact that we've always had new underground utilities underground, and our new utilities underground. So, what we're trying to do with this plan is just make sure that these new vertical utilities that can't be placed underground look as good as possible. And there aren't a whole lot of them, hopefully, that we can kind of limit and where they go, and try to control the aesthetic impact to our community. And then it talks a little bit about why we have utilities underground, the benefits of that, aside from just the visual benefit. There's less conflict, aerial conflicts, at least. I'm sure there's still a lot of underground conflicts and things that you run into from a utility perspective, but at least you don't have to worry about coming in and trimming trees, or if you have a tree that falls on an overhead utility line, that it doesn't knock your power out, things like that. So that was the needs section. And then we go to the assumptions section. We're assuming that we're going to continue to take utilities to the Planning Commission, that we're going to continue to go through here. We're assuming that we're going to continue to have all new utilities underground, except for the ones that we're talking about in this plan. And then we talk about the fact that we're acknowledging the existing utility system that's in our community. There are existing overhead utility systems, and that's what I've defined them as in the plan, that are really overhead distribution and transmission line systems mainly, that service multiple utilities and have several lines on them typically. So I wanted to be clear in the assumptions that really what we're talking about are these telecommunications and streetlights, essentially. We're actually not dealing with, or not proposing to deal with, residential street lighting. That's a much different type of light than regular street lights. It's also something that's not required by the town. Subdivisions, homeowners associations can, or developers, when they're putting a subdivision in, will choose as to whether they want to provide for street lighting. And then, they just have to follow the requirements in our subdivision regulations. There's a 16-foot height limit, so that's not going to work for telecommunications. Plus, the pole itself is not physically capable of accommodating these kind of additional structures. And a lot of times these poles aren't even in the public right of way. So that's another thing. We're not talking about utilities or anything that's outside of the public right of way. Even if they're in the utility easement, they're not really part of this plan. It's utilities that are new utilities that are in the public right of way. So then the objectives, I wanted to be clear that in the objectives, what we're really doing here is we're taking out subjectivity. We are establishing very prescriptive expectations for what we want to see in the town with these new vertical utilities, in terms of color, material, dimensions, consistency, compatibility. And we also want to try to minimize the proliferation of these new vertical utilities. Try to encourage co-location, first of all, or use existing systems. And if you can't, then require, a pole to have at least a dual function so that it can accommodate more than one user. And then there's some other things in there that are, your typical objectives when you're dealing with aesthetics. It's very important to the town, I think, also to focus a lot on minimizing the impact to existing residential communities, because the commercial areas it's important to address those, but where people live is even more critical. So we really want to focus on those areas in particular and encourage these new systems to be, to look at certain options first before they choose residential. The same way that they would look for co-locating on an existing utility system before they put a new pole in the ground in a new location. So with this also, we have a series of definitions in the plan.
Hey, Mark,
Yeah.
this is Jeremy. I just wanted to ask, do you have in this, so this is for new structures, are you putting any kind of aesthetics requirements for co-locates on, say, like our utility poles?
I'll get to that in a minute. It's obviously more flexible. Our goal is really to try to keep the new structures close to the pole, not have a lot of, keep the wiring near the pole if it's like wooden poles, and try to minimize the bulk of the new structures that are being added to the pole.
Okay,
So,
I didn't know if you
and
were
I can
putting
go,
that in
I'll
there.
go through that a little bit more here in a minute with a
Okay.
little bit more detail. But that's something I need some additional feedback on for sure. The definitions, we tried to add some terms that would be, pretty much specific to this document. Some of the important ones, really important ones, I think, are the cantina. The overhead utility system is a very important term, and that's actually something I just created. I didn't find any communities that had that actually defined. But, basically it's these existing distribution line systems, really the transmission line systems are pretty much completely exempt, I think, anyway. But the way we're treating it in this plan, existing distribution line systems and the structures that are on those systems or part of those systems are essentially grandfathered in. Now, if somebody wants to come and add something to that system, then what they add on there, it has to be, first of all, approved by the owner, which in this case would be LCUB. So if y'all don't let them put an antenna at the top, then, it doesn't happen. But there's certain things that we would like for them to try to do when they do add on to these. Now, one thing that I am proposing, and I didn't really realize that you would always have to replace a wooden pole. So that's something we'll need to talk through on this type 1 pole when we get to it. Because what I'm recommending right now is any new replacement pole would be a metal pole. So that may be something that may not work. So we'll just have to have a discussion about that. So yeah, the definitions, what is a utility? What's a right of way? Things like that. The applicability, what would this apply to and what would it not? Again, the structures that are part of an existing overhead utility system are grandfathered in. They're not part of this plan. So let's see the next section. I'm kind of going through this really quick because I don't know if y'all have had a chance to read through it and make some notes, and it might be useful just to, if you have, to just send me your markups too, from the plan itself if we don't get through discussing all these things. But I laid out an aesthetic plan process that kind of, goes hand in hand. If you've got a telecommunications application, then there's certain things that they need to address in the zoning ordinance, and then the appearance of the structures would be covered under this plan. I'll have to make some changes to the antennas and telecommunications part of the zoning ordinance to make it consistent with this plan and cross-reference it. I realize that. But then it just talks about the process, what generally would that entail. The first step is really just to meet with the applicant. Let's look at what their needs are, where they're proposing to add these structures, and see if there's a way to minimize the aesthetic impact. Are there other options that they could consider? And a lot of that's already talked about in their antennas and telecommunications ordinance, but it's just kind of reiterating the importance of having an early discussion about what you're planning to do or what you'd like to do, and working through the best way to minimize the impact, especially to residential areas. So if somebody is ending up with a new pole, then there's some specific requirements that we would expect them to follow aesthetically. And this would go through the Planning Commission, potentially the Board of Mayor and Aldermen. It just depends, but it very likely would rarely, if ever, go to the Board of Mayor and Aldermen. And then the kinds of documents that we would expect as part of a right-of-way permit, because that's going to be associated with the pole installation itself. And then we get to the real heart, I guess, of the aesthetic plan, and that is the requirements for the different types of pole systems that we have. And I went back and forth on this for a long time. There's a lot of stuff that you could do with this, and I really just am proposing probably the most simple, straightforward approach that, for consideration at least. And that is, the way I see it, you got three types of poles in your community. You got poles that are part of an existing overhead utility system. You've got street lights that are in a system that doesn't have any overhead utilities, like on Parkside Drive or South Campbell Station Road. And then you've got new poles in new locations. So the way the plan works is it deals with each of these very specifically. So type 1 poles are kind of like what Jeremy would be mostly involved with. And these are, probably mostly wooden poles, frankly, in the town, and at least with the distribution lines. If somebody can, and this is something we would talk with the applicant on, early on with the aesthetic plan process, is, in this location, this area where you want some coverage, is there an existing overhead utility system there? If so, have a discussion with LCUB and see if there's a way to, use that existing system without having to add additional poles. So that's obviously highly encouraged. I really kind of getting back to your question, Jeremy, what I guess our overall objectives, if you do that, and this is a wood pole, this is a bit, is that the structures, have kind of a compatibility and a consistency with themselves and also with other structures that may be on the pole. They're color compatible. They're close to the pole. They're not like protruding way out from the pole, and there's not a bunch of wires and cables hanging everywhere. So this is what we really don't want. Is where you've kind of added a bunch of bulk and clutter to this existing system. So that's something we would want to avoid. and try to encourage something like this, where you really hardly even notice this. Now, this is something that probably couldn't do with LCUB, it sounds like, but they've got the cantenna at the top of this pole. I'm not sure where this is. And then they've got a cabinet there on the pole itself, but it's close to the pole. It's not really particularly bulky. So that, if you're going to retrofit new structures on an existing system, that would be kind of the standard, I think, that we would try to encourage. Jeremy, do you have any thoughts on that? Because I think this type 1 pole would probably affect you all more than any of the others.
Yeah, I think one prudent thing would be for us to kind of coordinate, even in our agreements, and I think we state something in our current agreement that we have with the one customer one agreement we have existing, that, they have to get approval from the owner of the rights of way to attach. Just because we have a pole there, we have approval that we don't own the right of way, somebody else does. But I don't know that it addresses aesthetics, and it looks like in reading through this document that there's not a lot of difference in your aesthetics requirements versus ours. I can send ours to you if you want to take a look at it, but yours may be a little bit more stringent by a couple inches or so here and there. So it may be good for us to put something in our document that, they have to get approval from, and I don't know if you all own all the rights of ways in the area, because you could get into some areas that TDOT owns the right of way. So maybe our language needs to be a little different and reference your all's aesthetic plan, and then that has to be approved.
I think one of the big differences in just talking with you earlier, and I didn't realize this, is that apparently to use a pole in your existing system, it's always going to have to be replaced. So
that's only if we ever let them go above our above our power space, that's when it would have to definitely be replaced.
I got you.
We are not allowing that right now. That could change, but right now I would say it's rare, but there probably could find some poles out there that we may not have to change out, but given the size of most of these and the amount of attachments and telecoms we have on our poles, most of them are going to have to be changed out for a taller pole.
Yeah.
And
You have a lot of stuff on your poles. Yeah.
I think that's why they're not electing to go with our poles in a lot of situations, because our make ready cost, or what we call make ready to change the pole out, is a lot more than if they could set their own new pole.
Yeah, because what I was recommending here, my assumption on the type 1 pole is that it wouldn't have to be modified. They'll just, as long as it can carry the weight of whatever they're structurally sound enough. But what I am proposing with the other 2 poles is, if you did have to replace that, let's say this is a wood pole in a wood pole system, and what is in the draft now is that it would be going back as a metal pole.
Mm-hmm.
But the other structures could be attached as is to the metal pole. So that's something that we need to talk about, because I just want to be clear that you understand what's in the draft on that. Now, this pole here, since the antenna is below the lines, of course, this is not a super busy utility line, would probably be okay as a type 1 pole with that. Wouldn't have to be modified. In other words, the pole wouldn't have to be taken out of the ground, replaced.
Yeah. And as far as a steel pole, you may not get what you're looking for with us. If we changed a pole out for a make ready and put a small cell on it, Our requirements now would be that they put in a steel pole anyway, because we feel like steel poles have a longer life than a wood pole, and we don't want to have to fool with that pole any more than we'd have to, or any sooner. The problem would be is that our poles, if you've seen, are galvanized steel, and they are, you won't be able to put the holes in them and drill and put the cables inside the pole like you do on these, because of what I was mentioning earlier, degrading the structural capabilities of that pole by putting holes in them and stuff at the bottom of the pole. Obviously, at the top of the pole, they've got several holes in them already. So that's the only thing that we'd have to be concerned about.
Okay.
With the steel pole, like I said, it's just it's a galvanized steel.
Would
Some
a
people don't like those any better than they do a wood pole.
yeah, I know the reason for that was to try to get stuff in the pole, and that would actually be coming from the fiber that's in the ground below the pole, and it would be brought in from the ground into the pole instead of having to bore a hole in the pole. The idea would be it would, I mean, if there's a way to do that, but to bring it actually, you know, through
With
the
our
pole.
poles, you'd have to drill it, like the equipment housing and stuff, to get that fiber up and into it. You'd have to drill the base of the pole, which we would likely frown upon a little bit, just because of the structural integrity.
Okay.
Jeremy, where I know you guys have an agreement right now with one carrier. Is there a certain location on the pole that they're allowed to go in?
Yes, I have that defined. It may be easier just to send that over to you all. They're allowed to go in what we call the comm space or the support space. And that's different for every pole. I mean, different height poles. It's defined by where our power equipment is, whether it could be a neutral, a transformer that defines that, or it could be a light that defines that. And then as far as down as the top telecom, whatever that could be, so whatever that space is in there. But we have that defined in our agreement. I'd be happy to.
But all those areas are typically below the power lines. Is that correct?
They are always, yes. We like I said, we don't allow above the power lines right now. We've taken the stance with KUB for safety and reliability concerns. We don't allow it above. And I know Nashville, NES, they allow it. And I'm open-minded. If somebody can bring a reasonable, good argument to me, we'll consider it. Because I know it's a hindrance for them. They don't want to go on our poles because of that rule, that kind of rule we have in place.
Because they want to be higher up on the pole,
Exactly.
basically at the top of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You have to have a certain separation too, don't you, Jeremy, between their structure
Yeah,
and
we
yours?
do. It's the NESC National Electric Safety Code. It's I think it's just like 40 inches, 42 inches. But most of the time, if they're going to go above the pole, from what I've heard, they want to go about 10 feet above. I mean, I'm sorry, the power line. They want to go about 10 feet above that. So you'd have our wires up there, and then you'd have 10 feet of extra pole, and then their antennas on top of that, or connected to the top of that.
That's probably why the state laws got 10 feet.
Yeah, yeah. And
Let me, yeah, because obviously I'm gonna have to have some conversations and more detailed conversations with you all in particular about some of these things. But let me just go through this again real quick, and I'll just
Hey, Mark, let me ask a quick question.
Yeah.
Looking at the drawing and the photographs, my question may be irrelevant, but I think it's important to ask. Do we have any provisions anywhere that define the existence of ladders or climbing hooks or similar things that allow people to go up the pole my thinking is that if there are ladders or climbing hooks, it's going to be just like when I was a kid. Some kid's going to want to climb it.
Well, LCUB has standards on that, I'm sure. And so, yeah,
LCUB standard is that any pole with a small cell has to be within 15 foot of a road and reachable by a bucket truck. In other words, we will not climb it.
Okay, awesome.
Okay, the second type of pole, remember I only had 3 in this draft. The type 2 pole would be an existing pole that would have to be replaced to accommodate the proposed additional vertical utilities. What we've seen so far, the most common example of that's been our light poles on Parkside Drive that have been replaced. Those actually, the old poles have actually been taken over to our public works facility so we could have spares if we needed them. So what we're talking about in that section of the plan is that's also an encouraged option because again, you got an existing pole, an existing location. If you can accommodate these new structures on that pole, then that's better than putting a new pole in a new location. As I mentioned earlier, we're proposing galvanized steel so that it would have a hollow interior and the opportunity to place components within the pole and create as stealth appearance as possible. And this is an example of what we would be looking for in a type 2 pole. You got the light fixture there. You got, and this one has a 4 and 5G option at the top. And then you've got that 4G radio antenna cabinet at the bottom. And all these sections of the pole system have a transitional element that makes the pole look seamless. Those are all kind of important aspects to trying to make these blend in to the greatest extent possible and look as narrow and least bulky as you can possibly have. So with everything, the equipment would be shrouded. The equipment is actually built as part of or contained within the pole. And these are again the ideal situation that we're recommending. That all the equipment's consistent between the components. As I mentioned earlier, the transitions are appropriate. And then, the light fixture, the location of the light fixture would allow for the most stealth possible location for telecommunication antennas. That's an issue right now that we have with some of our street lights on Campbell Station and Parkside Drive. Is the light is at the very top of the sign or top of the pole. And so the antennas have to, when they're added to the pole, they have to protrude away from the light for reception purposes. So the idea would be to actually have the antenna or the antenna shroud above the light so that you eliminate that conflict. So that's something we need to look at with light pole systems, I think, as lights transition in and out throughout our community. So similar to type 1 pole, we're just trying to minimize bulk and clutter there on these systems. These are pretty bad examples. Here's some that are a little more stealth, but they still have a lot of wires, a lot of things, hanging off of the poles. They certainly don't look very discreet. So, obviously structurally, the foundation has to be able to accommodate all the structures envisioned for that pole. That's, obviously the reason why our light poles have to be replaced is that they weren't designed to accommodate the weight of small cell support structure systems. So that's something that obviously you'd need to make sure about. Establishing some very specific dimensional limitations on the structures that can be added to poles. So what's in the draft is that the outer dimension of a cantenna is limited to 19 inches. Most of them are going to be less than that. Most of the 4Gs are going to be between 14 and 16. inches, and the 5Gs could go out to as wide as 19. And then that cabinet at the base of the sign would be maxed out at 20 inches. Making sure that all the wires and the cabling is hidden either in the pole, or if it's on a wood pole, it's attached right against the pole, so it's not visible. And then thinking about our lighting system being not just lights now, we have to think about when a light is added somewhere, that light needs to serve more than one function. And can it provide for the opportunity to have a telecommunications antenna on that pole in the future? So some examples of acceptable type 2 poles. These are all light poles that were replaced to accommodate telecommunications as well. You can see there's all kinds of different styles. I don't really particularly care for a couple of these lights, but and then finally the type 3 poles. Those are least desirable because this is new poles in new locations, which is what I'm trying to think here. I think all of Verizon's initial round would be type 3 poles. What we're proposing with these poles, similar to type 2, is that they would be galvanized steel, again, so that you can put stuff inside the pole to lessen the bulk. And then here's an example of dual function requirement that's in these type 3 poles. The one on the left is a dual function pole. It has 2 different types of telecommunications technologies. And the pole on the right is dual function. It has the option of 4 or 5G plus a light in there. And then you can see that the cabinets at the bottom to kind of balance out the pole as a whole, as you got wider space at the top and the bottom with a pretty narrow riser pole in between. And then all the transitional parts of the system kind of blend in together. So that's what we would be looking at in the draft if someone were to propose a new pole in a new location. It would look something like that.
Quick question. The illustration shows a combination of basically co-locating 4G and 5G. What about co-locating 2 5Gs on one pole?
Yeah, you could do 2 5Gs. You could do a 5G AT&T, 5G US Cellular. All that we're recommending or requiring in the draft is that the pole has at least a dual function. So that would qualify. Yeah,
right.
It could be 2 5Gs.
As long as both are permitted, that would be a good thing. Whether or not we do that in actual practicality,
Yeah.
What do the residents want, and also what do the suppliers want to consider?
Yeah, and I know there's concern about that they've had in the past. What we're trying to do with obviously the co-location is to lessen the need for more poles in the future by allowing the ones that do go up to have the ability to accommodate more than one use on them. So with the type 3 poles, since they are new poles and new locations, we've got a section in the draft that talks about placement requirements. Some of those may or may not be possible, but I've got them in there. And it's the typical things that you would think about. But really what we want to try to encourage these folks to do is to try to avoid residential areas if they can. And if they do have to put them in a residential area, let's look at the open space lots. Where are they? Would any of those work? If that doesn't work, then let's try to put them on side property lines. Let's avoid existing potential tree conflicts. Obviously avoid creating obstructions or interference with existing public infrastructure, things like that. So just a lot of different placement requirements for these type poles. The other 2 poles, since they're existing locations, really aren't subject to this. It's just for these type 3 poles.
I've got a concern about, earlier on, you said about function, that we could not prevent function. Go back to the previous screen where it said, well, you've got it there, trees trimmed, poles should not be placed. No, that's not it. Well,
This one?
yeah, locate near tree canopy, ensure just that right there. My concern is if you say that would restrict function if they couldn't do that, as far as near tree or tree trimming, so that the function will be.
And there's some of that stuff in this section that it would probably have to, give it some flexibility, I guess. So yeah, there could be situations where it could, severely limit, if not prohibit, the service, and that would be an issue, obviously. So that's probably something we'll need to look at. And I was well aware of that, being a potential issue. We just have to word it such that it's very important, but maybe if they could, yeah, go ahead.
Going off of what Mayor Williams just said, I'd rather leave it in, even though I know we can't technically require them to prove to us anything. I'd rather leave in any kind of, especially anything dealing with the trees. We may not be able to enforce it, but then I'd like to be able to push them to push back on us. I'd rather not leave anything on the table. If we want to save our tree canopy or save our trees, it's going to require us to kind of push back on them and say, hey, you need to prove to us that this is where it needs to be. So I don't have a problem leaving it in, understanding that at present, with the way the state law is written, we may not be able to ask. I think we should be putting more in that we may not be able to ask, but make sure that we're doing everything we can within the limit of the law. So.
Well, I agree. That's, I just, with what you're saying, Vice Mayor, I just want to make sure that there's not some sort of loophole to where I got you. I'd like for us to make sure that they go deep enough to get around roots, if they're putting in fiber, and also if they're putting in a pole, that it's, that they don't have to trim trees or cut a tree just so that they can, make it function. That, in my opinion, needs to go someplace else. So instead of.
Understood. Okay. I thank you. Okay. Makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, and I tried to be a lot more, that's where we're a lot more prescriptive too, is with the placement requirements in this draft. It gets into a lot more specifics than what's in their antennas language so far. Let's see here, little diagram showing that. The last section.
Mark, back up a couple of slides. Slide 31, might be slide 30.
Which one? What is it about?
Go one more slide forward. The other direction, toward the end. There you go. Okay, back up one slide.
To the diagram?
Now go backwards toward the front of the presentation, one slide.
That's back.
Okay, now, okay, I'm sorry. Go forward. Go forward one. Go forward one more.
Okay.
On that slide, you have several times you've used the word should, and should is just a recommendation. Be sure that when you're really writing this out, that you say shall when you mean it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm trying to look here at the actual ordinance. Well, now I'll tell you this, and the PowerPoint's a little different. I was kind of paraphrasing on it from the ordinance. The ordinance is more specific. It does say type 3 poles shall be placed using the following requirements. And then it goes through a bunch of basically these things, but it starts that, leads into that by saying shall.
Okay.
So I think the PowerPoint's not as strong a language as the actual draft of the plan itself. Yeah.
Very good. Don't want us to get burned that way. As an old-time spec writer, I got burned a couple of times back.
Yeah, there's a big difference between should and shall. I think some of that language I might have taken from a PowerPoint that was done back in June too.
Yeah.
Something that I haven't really spent a whole lot of time on, and I did have some help trying to get some research on this, but is really lighting fixtures, because that's the other new vertical or modified vertical utilities that this plan really is addressing. It's telecommunications and street lighting. So we really need to have a conversation about what kind of lighting systems that we envision in the town, now and in the future, as poles are changed out and repurposed. Is there a certain type of pole and type of fixture that can accommodate obviously telecommunications, but also certain light fixtures and mounting styles that would be appropriate for the context. So that's really what this last section is talking about, is that if you have a type 2 or 3 or maybe even 1 pole, that if it's in a residential area or mixed-use town center, mixed-use neighborhood, that it needs to have a decorative fixture option, and maybe also for a gateway. So that would kind of apply as well to all 3 pole types, depending on the context. So if you were in the mixed-use town center area or a residential area, you may see something like this. Something similar to what Verizon actually proposed at Tacoma Turkey Creek was a pretty stealth pole. Originally, they had a light fixture proposed on that pole that was trying to emulate the neighborhood streetlights in that subdivision. And other than being 10 feet taller than those poles, it looked pretty compatible to me. So that's the kind of light styles that we'd probably want to see in these areas. I don't know that we need to come up with a standard that applies everywhere. I think it might make more sense to provide for some options, and depending on the context, that people could choose from, a series of options. The problem with lighting is I've known in working with it on site developments over the years, is it's constantly evolving. It's like telecommunications. I mean, our ordinance, it needs to be updated for outdoor site lighting, because the technology has changed so much since it was created several years ago. And that's, something that's always going to be the challenge, is speccing a light fixture that, may be obsolete in a year or two. I think that the idea would be that this general style of fixture and mounting arm is what we would want to see in these areas, when lights are added to these existing poles, or poles replaced and a new light is added.
Mark,
Yeah.
I would just comment real quick that I'm not sure if we do your maintenance contract for your lights, if we maintain them, but we do with others if we don't yours. Standardize is a strong word, but keeping them as many as close to possible, just because having to keep several different items in stock can get expensive after a while, instead of having to be able to keep one particular product versus 10 different ones. It can get expensive keeping that.
Maybe if you had a decorative light fixture, maybe just have a couple of options in that kind of category.
Yeah, I would limit it at least, especially on, whether it's LED or whatever that you have installed, to size as far as wattage and stuff like that. But even the fixture type itself, it can, you know, when you're keeping 10 different light fixtures in stock, it can drive costs up. Just a point to make.
No, that's good. Yeah.
I've got something as well. Offer or say you're going to have two functions on that light. We'll use Sweetbriar as an example. Let's say that they go in there like they're fixing to do, and Sweetbriar does not want streetlights. So, function.
Well, what you can do is you provide for a pole that should a additional telecommunications provider want to locate in the area, that pole will be able to accommodate that additional provider. So it could be more than one telecommunication company, or if a subdivision had existing streetlights and they didn't want another light, a luminaire, you could add, a fake light, and we've seen that before. That wouldn't really qualify under the language because that's not really a functioning component, but aesthetically that could make it blend in with the other streetlights. But by having the dual function, it's all really in setting up the system itself for the ability to have that dual function in the future. Because a lot of these poles are not going to come in with a dual function right off the bat.
Mark, it's Louise again. Here's my concern. I know that Sweetbriar does not want lights now, but what happens in 10 years or 15 years? I don't know how long these poles will be around. But if they have people move in that decide, as a whole, I think we'd like to have these lights on now. And we've outfitted them with fake lights and they're not usable. What's the drawback of making one usable but not illuminating it?
Well, that's another option. You could do that. Yeah.
So it would seem like one situation that would occur is if you've got these dummy light fixtures, Jeremy or somebody's going to be getting phone calls constantly. Hey, the pole's burnt out.
Yeah, what's wrong with the light? It's out all the time.
Yeah.
There have been communities that do that, though. I just mentioned that as an option because there's some communities I looked at in Colorado because of their dark skies. They're really picky about the night sky out there, and I can understand why, because it's beautiful. So they want the pole to look like, it has a light fixture on it, like it's not just a small cell structure, but it's not going to be activated.
Mark, this is Trevor. Maybe ask if you can clarify this. As I'm kind of looking at the main principle here of this dual capability, I'm reading that when we're putting in a light pole, the second capability is co-location of an antenna. And when we're installing a new pole for an antenna, the second capability is a light fixture. So we really just are getting at the capability of a second function. Whether we actually utilize it is a separate issue, right?
That's right. Yeah, because that's what I was getting back to from the earlier part of the objectives of this plan, and that's to think about what might happen in the future and to provide for a pole and a system of fiber, opportunity for fiber to come up into that pole or electricity for a light that would allow that pole to have more than one function in the future if you don't have that initial dual function on the front end.
All right, I had a second question for Mr. Walden. Going back to what you're talking about with, the cost of stocking multiple fixtures, et cetera. I just want to make sure I'm understanding. Are you advocating that we choose perhaps a single fixture and that creates economy of scale for you, just having to stock one type of fixture?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was talking about. Just keeps you know, if, for example, if we maintain your lights, it keeps our inventory down. Anytime we can keep our inventory down, that's a good thing, right? So, saves us money, saves ratepayer money. When you're having to supply several different onesie twosies, different bulbs, different things like that, you have to keep a lot more inventory for replacement purposes, and it just drives up costs. So I don't know if you could drive it down to one, but you know, limit it as much as you can would be my recommendation.
Now, one of my concerns about the whole there, as far as a multitude of them, is a good example in our neighborhood. The ones we started out with were fine, but guess what? They discontinued that one. And now what? You know,
That's a major problem. Yeah, that happens all the time in lighting.
we got a universal one, and that you can screw or put an LED bulb into, and just had to go with it. Didn't have no choice.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about earlier with lighting. It's such a tricky thing to try to, regulate, because it's constantly evolving, the technology and the fixtures and everything else. This style here that's on the screen is similar to what has been added to the new metal poles on Concord Road. It's part of that project. So that, to me, that's kind of a nice gateway area light fixture that kind of gives you that sense of arrival into a different space, a different community. And it, can be obviously retrofitted onto an existing overhead utility system that has, distribution lines on it. So I don't know how much you were involved with that, Jeremy, but those light fixtures, I know that was kind of worked out with TDOT, but I think once they're operational, I don't believe they have been yet, but they're going to make a really unique look to that corridor. Really give you that little sense of arrival, I think, and that's something that this plan is kind of looking at, is if we're going to specify how these light fixtures look, then we kind of need to think about if we want to have different ones in different locations in the community and what those might look like.
Mark, I was just going to throw out, I'm just thinking in terms of, the process of approving new fixtures and poles from an administrative standpoint. I think it would improve the quality of our aesthetic plan if it's super clear, super simple what we're actually asking for. So I think it's actually really beneficial for everyone if we have, even if we have a different pole and different structure, different light fixture required in maybe town center versus, another commercial area, that we limit that as much as possible. That way there's really no confusion about what we're actually asking them to install.
Yeah, it sounds like that would be better for LCUB, and that certainly makes sense. You don't want to have, just a whole large list of fixtures that you got to try to keep inventory in case something happens and you have to replace it. So I get that. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I tell you,
I guess
right now. Sorry, Mark.
I
I was going to say, Jeremy may know better, but I think right now we really only got the one main light fixture in town throughout most of the town. We do have a new fixture coming down Concord Road when that project gets done, and that'll be that first decorative fixture. So I know that'll be new for that. So that may be the only two we have currently. I think the question is going to be, do we want that new decorative fixture other locations? And I think that'll be helpful to talk through over the next few meetings to determine that with the committee, the planning commission, the board. I know we're coming up to time here, near 7. Mark, you just have a couple more things to wrap up before we call tonight? You're still on mute, Mark.
sorry, we can wrap it up now, actually, because we're a little after 7. We really, I guess it would be helpful for me, if possible, if y'all could take a look at these last 2 pages of the PowerPoint and just, well, it might just be 1 page. And well, actually 2. And let me know your thoughts on those questions. Obviously, we need to have another meeting, but it would be helpful in formulating modifications to what we have if I kind of received your all's feedback on these general questions at the end of this PowerPoint. I think you all have a copy of that. And then I can kind of take that feedback. Maybe if you could get me that, by the middle to end of next week or something like that. And I'll try to go through that and see if there's, what the general consensus was. And then we can kind of, at the next meeting, we'll kind of talk through that more specifically and talk through some of these things that we really didn't have time to deal with tonight. But those last 2 slides are really important because I really need to kind of at a stopping point in some aspects of this plan until I get some feedback. So if that sounds like a good plan, if y'all wouldn't mind to do that, it would be very helpful. And then we'll get together and try to do we want to talk about the next meeting and see what people's schedules look like, or
We'd probably, I think, Mark, we'd probably like to get together in the next 2 to 3 weeks, wouldn't we? To try to have another.
I would think so when it's fresh. Yeah, I would think so.
You may not be in front of your calendars now, but let me and Mark get together and kind of throw out a couple of dates to everyone in 2 or 3 weeks from now and see what works for the group. And then we'll get that out to everybody to put on your calendars if that works.
Sounds good. For me, at least, this 5 o'clock window works really nicely. I don't know about anybody else, but it does fit right now with my schedule very cleanly for the next 2 to 3 weeks.
Good for you, Jeremy, too. 5 o'clock. Okay. We'll work on that and just try to find a couple of days where we're both available and get everybody together.
Okay, Mark, a quick question on submitting feedback to you. Would you prefer just all in one email than whatever we send you, or are you okay with getting an attachment?
Whatever is easiest for you all is fine with me. It really is, because y'all are spending your free time on this, and however is easier for you. If you want to handwrite it on a printout and put it in my mailbox, that's fine. Doesn't matter.
All right. Well, Jeremy and I will send Morse code back and forth.
Okay. That'll be good. Well, I appreciate your all's time tonight, and we'll be getting with you all on the next meeting and go from there, I guess.
Thank you, Mark.
All right.
Thanks
a
guys.
lot.
Appreciate it.
Y'all have done a great job. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Jeremy, great to see you again.
Good to see you too.
Thanks.